Hello! In this video, we're going to be talking about another specific kind of graph and focusing on the things that make those kinds of graphs good or bad. And in this video, we're going to be talking about scatterplots. Now, why scatterplots as another focus for the kinds of graphs we're going to look at? Well, because they are very difficult to get right. They're very hard to do. And the problem with them is that they are busy. Scatterplots, by their nature, put a lot of information on the page, which, if we're talking about data communication, as we've gone over again and again and again and again, the idea is focus. You want people to focus on the data story that you are trying to tell and that you can support with your analysis. And this can be difficult if you are using a scatterplot where all of the information has to go on the page. So what can we do with that? Well, the first thing I can tell you is that there's a couple of the kinds of situations where scatterplots are good, and we're going to want to make sure that we're only using scatterplots in those situations. The first one, if you are talking to a highly technical audience, if you're giving an academic presentation to your professor or you're publishing a paper in an academic journal, then yes, scatterplots, fantastic, because everybody who's seeing it is going to know what it means to look at an individual data point on a graph and make sense of it. Great. Okay, technical audience, that's good. Use a scatterplot. It's fantastic. They love looking at all the data. I love looking at all the data. It makes sense to me because I work with data all the time. But what if you're not talking to somebody who is working with data all the time? In that case, there's really only a couple of situations in which you want to use a scatterplot. Situation number one, there are very few data points that you have, and so you can put all of them on the graph without necessarily making things too busy. Situation number two, there is a very clear relationship between your data points. Again, scatterplots have a relationship between an x-axis variable and a y-axis variable. That's what we can present, and we're going to put all the data points on the graph for that relationship. Now, there should be a very clear relationship that emerges in order to make sense of the graph. So, for example, take this graph right here. In this graph, there is a very clear positive relationship. There's a couple of points out of place, of course, right? That's one of the benefits of seeing the whole graph as opposed to just putting a line on there or something like that, that we can see all those points, but generally there is a positive relationship. I can show this graph to you and say, hey, there is a positive relationship between GDP per capita and life expectancy, and you can say, oh, yeah, I can see that on this graph. Forget about all the noise and colors and shapes and whatever. I can see just from the points themselves, this is a positive relationship. If it's that clear, scatterplots are good to go. The only other situation which I would really recommend using a scatterplot for a non-technical audience is if you don't really need all the points. If you are trying to highlight just a few points and maybe the other points are on there for comparison, then yes, a scatterplot can work really well. So when are we going to use a scatterplot? One, technical audience. Two, very clear relationship that we want to show. Three, there's only a couple of points that we need to point out, and everything else is background. Okay? Outside of that, I mean, I'm not going to say that it's impossible to find a good scatterplot that doesn't obey one of those three things, but it's hard to do. So given that we are going to be in one of those scenarios, how can we do it? So the first thing let's talk about if we have a very clear relationship. So that's simple. If you have a clear relationship, it's very clearly points are going in the same direction. Points are going in opposite directions. There's no relationship whatsoever. It's just noise and chaos. You can just put it on the graph. And if you just put it on the graph, it will be pretty clear, right? There's all sorts of colors and shapes here, but you don't really need any of them. You know what the relationship is that we are presenting on this graph. And so the scatterplot is to some degree effective. Outside of that, what if we want to show distinction? What if I want to, on this graph, for example, distinguish between Africa and America and Asia and Europe and Oceania? Okay? Well, what should I do in that case? Well, there's a couple of different things that you can do that will allow you to distinguish points from each other. And some of them we can see right here. Obvious ones, color. You can group things by color. It'll make it very easy to tell them apart. Shape is another one. Now, we don't want to go overboard on this, right? Because look at this graph right here. The shapes are a mess. I can't reasonably label the clusters of points because they're all over the place, right? I can't just put the word America next to the little triangles because that's America, because that won't necessarily make it that much easier, and I'd need to have so many different labels on here. I almost have to have a legend to work with this. So you can't go too crazy with shapes, because they're also, at a certain point, you run out of easily distinguishable shapes. So for example, can you really easily tell apart those circles from those squares? If it weren't for the color, Maybe you could, but not everybody would be able to at first glance. So the shapes can sort of run into each other. Size is difficult. You can use size to distinguish shapes, but on a scatter plot, you pretty much only want to use size not to distinguish groups, but to encode information. And really the only times I've really seen this work super well is when that size is population. I've seen a number of really great scatter plots where the size of a point corresponds to the population in an area. There are, of course, other ways you could do this well, but just all the really good examples that I happen to have seen are population. So here, for example, I've just picked out Asia, reducing the number of points I need to draw, which is a good thing, right? And I've used the size of the point to represent the size of the country in terms of population. That's very easy to see, right? You can look at this and pretty immediately, even without looking at the description of the hidden down there at the bottom, says size indicates population. You might guess that size indicates population. At least that those are the big countries, the really big dots. So that's something that we can do with size. There's not a lot else we can do with different kinds of ways to distinguish points. I'm not going to say there's nothing else, but those are sort of the big ones. And that's sort of what we're limited to: size, shape, shape, color, and in some cases size as well, and of course position on the X or Y axes. There are other options for ways to distinguish them, but it gets pretty tricky to work with. Which means that we need to really limit the number of kinds of groups that we need to distinguish because there's only so many options that we have. And as you can tell from looking at this graph, it's really hard to do without using a legend. Legends are not a very efficient way to get across information. I would really like to take that Africa label and move it over by Africa, but the problem is Africa is in a lot of places. And a lot of the places where Africa is also next to other stuff. So it could be very difficult to use labels on the graph there. So we don't want to use too many groups. We ideally might want to pare down the number of groups that we need to distinguish here. We can see one way of doing this by highlighting. So I mentioned that one good way of using a scatter plot is if we only need to really focus on a couple of points and everything else is not that important. We can do that with highlighting. So here you can see I'm really interested in Asia, and I might compare Asia to other countries, but I'm not that interested in the other countries. So I'm going to take all those other countries and lump them into one category, which is not Asia. And then I'm going to put them as a non-highlighted version. So the Asia is going to really pop as being this dark black color with the very faded blue colors, which is everything else. Those are still there, but they're very much in the background. This is a lot easier to parse than this graph right here, where I'm actually labeling everything. And this sort of goes into your goal whenever you're creating a scatter plot. If you're creating a scatter plot that has a lot of points, your goal is to remove as much information as you possibly can and only show the information that you absolutely need to. Because a scatter plot is a very inefficient way of giving you information that is not already encoded in the position of the point. It's great at showing you the position of the point. Everything else, it's not so great at. So you need to reduce everything that it's not so great at, as in everything that's not the position, as far as you can. Take it out. So instead of 5 different continents here, just Asia and not Asia. Because Asia and not Asia is not on the x-axis, it's not on the y-axis. And so unless I really, 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 really want to show continent, I shouldn't do it. I should try to back off in the kind of information that I'm providing to you. Other things to point out for scatterplots is labeling individual points. So I mentioned you want to show scatterplots work really well if you really only need to focus on a few points. Other ways you can do that besides highlighting is to label the points or to encircle the points. And so, of course, we know all about data labels. You can do that with geom text or geom label on top of the scatterplot points that you already have. So in that case, you would say, okay, well, I've got this scatterplot of a whole bunch of different countries here, but I really only want to focus on Thailand. So I'm going to take the one Thailand point. I'm going to say, hey, this is Thailand. Everything else is everything else, but hey, this is Thailand. That's easy to see. And it makes it very easy to compare Thailand to everything else and see where Thailand is in the grand scheme of things. So the data label of a single or a few points can be really handy. We can also encircle things. So here, for example, I've said, okay, I'm not really interested in all the countries, but I'm really interested in showing how there's a couple of African countries that have a really high really low life expectancy despite having relatively high GDP. I can circle those off. There's all this other information about all these other countries, but I don't need to worry about it so much because I know that I can focus on just these 4 points over here on the right. That's a lot less information for me to process. Everything else just becomes the comparison. I can show you all the data and still have something meaningful. Some common pitfalls that we fall into that occur because scatterplots are so hard to do is 1, having too many points, 2, having points that overlap. If you have discrete data as opposed to continuous data, it's common that different points will just be stacked on top of each other so you can't see them. You can jitter them. Geom jitter is an option there, but that only goes so far. So if you have really discrete data, maybe scatterplots are not what you want to do. You don't want to rely too much on shape, because if I have a million different shapes on there, I have to go back and forth to the legend to figure it out. It's not going to be very informative to me. Also, unclear takeaways. You can put anything on a scatter plot. It's really hard to tell a story with a scatter plot unless that story is really, really obvious. So you want to make sure that the story is obvious, either by showing me a scatter plot where the location tells the story, which is what scatter plots are good at, or figuring out what the story is for a few points and showing me those points in really sharp focus, where everything else sort of falls to the background. Now, I mentioned it can be difficult when you have too many points. There are a couple of little fixes that you can do. So, for example, you have a lot of points here. They're all sort of overlapping with each other. It's hard to tell things apart. One thing that I can do is use heat maps. So I can say, well, it's really hard to tell if there's like 10 points here or 20 points here. Like, that's hard to tell apart. But I can use color to distinguish how many points are in an area. So I can use sort of a heat map approach to tell you what's really common. All right, that's the basics of scatter plots, right? You want to show as little information as possible that isn't encoded in the x-y relationship, because scatter plots are great at showing the relationship between x and y, if there is such a relationship. It's not so great at anything else. So take everything else you're trying to do and get it out of there. Make sure you're either trying to show something about that shape, that relationship, or you have a couple points that you want me to focus on. Show me those points with highlighting, with labeling, with encircling, a couple of different options there. Okay, that's it. Go ahead and make some great scatter plots. Thank you.